Thought I saw Shmuel a second ago, and I think he disappeared. Okay.
I'm still here, Rabbi.
Hi, Shmuel. Okay. All right. So just to continue where we were yesterday, I'm gonna try my best to finish at least 5 to 7, so that we can, those who are saying slichas at 7 will be able to get there in time. He says as follows. He says, we were talking about a person, any person who belongs to a condo group, like an apartment building, like the conservatory, like Shmuel was discussing yesterday, or if you belong to a homeowners association where everyone, let's say, is part of a development. So each one of the neighbors can be assessed by the association, based upon the needs of the entire community. Let's say for doing repairs to the building or landscaping. But he said it all depends upon what is considered to be an acceptable expenditure for a neighborhood to make. Once it becomes an unreasonable amount, so then you're allowed to protest al pi halacha, and you could take them, let's say, to a beis din and say, I don't want to have to pay for this frivolous, what I deem to be a frivolous expenditure. And then in the Likutim, we were talking about a situation where a person owns a home but doesn't live in it. Can he be, what can he be assessed for? So he can be assessed for things that are needed for the security of his home, even when he's not living there. He can be assessed for Vuhu adin hotzos avur tiura. And this is where we were up to yesterday. He says he can be assessed for Eno chayv liishtatef behotzos hanikayon shel habinyan. He's not obligated to pay for expenditures having to do with the cleaning of the building if his home is, or his apartment is vacant, and he's not responsible for the cleanliness, and he's not contributing to the dirtiness of the structure. V'chein shar hotzos dumya dahanal, and then anything else that has to do with the regular maintenance and upkeep due to traffic. If he's not contributing to that traffic, he shouldn't be assessed for it. But masha'en kein hotzos v'tikunim shehunena mehem, v'zet tzarich liishtatef af she'eino darsham. But if he is receiving benefit, even though he's not living in that apartment, he is assessed for those, and he has an obligation to pay. V'hu adin hotzos avur tiura she'im eino darsham eino chayv l'shalem rak et tashlum haminimum shenigva mecheret hachashmal gam im lo mishtamshim. It says any expenses for electricity, for utilities in these shared spaces, you shouldn't have to pay, except the minimum that the electric company would charge, even if you're not living there. V'chein chayav b'hotzot shel tikun v'achzaka. He says you'd have to pay for repairs, even of shared spaces, and reinforcement of the building if it needs reinforcement. And as far as landscaping, some say that's under the same rubric as maintaining security, where it's the upkeep of the beautification of the property, and therefore you should be assessed for it as well. It's not something that necessarily you need just because you're living there, but it's for the upkeep of the building in general. Okay, ma'alit v'komat karka shelo shayach klal sheyishtamesh bo ledirato. Here's another interesting question. I live in an apartment building on the ground floor. Am I obligated to pay for the upkeep or the repair of the elevator? Interesting, right? Because I don't use the elevator. So can I be assessed for the elevator? Mitzad hadin nirashuhu patur. So technically, he says, it would seem to me that you're exempt because you shouldn't have to pay. for a service in the building that you're not using. But if when you purchase the apartment, you signed a contract that you are obligated to share in all of the expenses, including the elevator, so then obviously you are going to be obligated. But if there is no contract, if there's no agreement, you do have a right to present your case to the homeowners association and say, hey, why should I have to pay for this? The elevator repair, I'm not benefiting from it at all. Okay. And then in the next likutim that we'll see is that it's forbidden to gaze into someone else's yard or house. The following case is where there is a wall between the Reuven and Shimon's property. And so even though Reuven has a window that is facing Shimon's property, there's a wall between them. So the window, it does not expose his visibility to Shimon's goings on in his backyard. But then v'nafal hakosel ba'al yedei zeh Reuven roa l'rishos chavero. But then the wall collapses, and now Reuven has full view of Shimon's yard. Tzarich listom chalonosav afal pi she'asam beheter. So the halacha would require Reuven to block off his windows, or maybe to paint them black temporarily, or to seal them off. V'yesh cholkim, but some disagree, and they say that since you built them in a permissible fashion, you're not obligated after the fact to seal them. But v'ha'ikar kedeya rishona, the hesek re'iyah havigiri delay. But as Rabbi Akiva Eger paskins, we paskin like the first opinion, that you are obligated to seal off the window because the damage that you cause with your viewing and seeing what your neighbor is doing is a very substantive, direct form of damage. And whereas before you weren't able to see, now you are, you have to stop yourself from doing that. But that's only in a case where the wall fell down and you made the window before the wall collapsed, and now the wall collapsed. So you now have a venue of visibility. You have to block that off. But let's say I built a window on the side of an empty lot, okay? And then my friend occupied that lot that had been previously empty, or he may have built a house on that lot, or he may have extended his backyard into that lot. So and now he's using it for private use. So that it wouldn't seem fair to force me to seal off my window, because he came in after the fact. He came in after I had established visibility of that empty area. And he cannot now say, well, I want to use it for private use, so you have to seal off your window. He says if Reuven, who has the house with the window, has already established a pattern of use of using that air side of his house to get sunlight and to look through the window, Shimon, who now has built a backyard right adjacent to him, or has built a house adjacent to him, cannot force him to seal off his window. That seems pretty self-evident. And then finally, Adam Sherotza Litakein Beito, Virotza Lahamid Litzorach Zeh Sulam Betoch Chatzar Chavero, Lefa'amim Yochol Chavero La'akev Alav. If a person wants to repair his house, let's say he needs to do some roofing, or he needs to do some kind of painting on the side of his house, and he needs to set up a ladder on the side of his house, and that ladder is going to be on his neighbor's property. So there are certain circumstances where the neighbor will be allowed to stop him if the neighbor's trespassing on his property will potentially cause damage to to the neighbor. So he doesn't give all of the circumstances, but we can only conjecture that perhaps you can prevent a person from using your property as a point of access to his property in situations where he wants to, the neighbor wants to use his backyard, let's say for his own use, or, he's entertaining guests, or he's doing something private at that moment. He can probably stop you. Or if your ladder is going to be causing damage to his landscaping or things like that. So there are circumstances where two neighbors have to work things out between themselves. And usually conflicts arise because one or both parties are just simply not being reasonable with each other. I think I mentioned to you the other day that there was a case that David Odianoy and I were involved with two neighbors who live next door to each other who are members of the Bayit. And the just is, one neighbor is a pride of ownership kind of, very immaculately maintained property. And the other is mamash, the opposite, the diametric opposite. A guy who, King Solomon said in Mishlei, "Ba'atzaltayim yimacha mekareh, u'b'shiflut yadayim yidlof habayit," that through laziness the roof will collapse, and through a lack of initiative of your hands, the house will start to leak. So, there are some people who, as soon as there's the slightest malfunction in their home, they're right on it because they want their house to be immaculate. And there are other people who allow their home to fall into disrepair, and you can tell right away. The eaves troughs are cracking and disintegrating, and the paint is peeling, and all these things are falling apart. And usually the inside of the house is also just as bad. And so these two neighbors live next door to each other, and so whatever shared space that they have between themselves is a recipe for disaster. It's not that one person is a good person and one person is a bad person. It's that they have two different approaches to property maintenance, and it creates a very, very difficult situation. And sometimes one neighbor is not as reasonable or sensitive to the needs of his other neighbor, and they clash. And so, not easy to deal with these common property issues. Okay, so based on this halacha that we saw in Yud Aleph, the continuation of this halacha is now in Yud Beis. And he writes as follows: Ulefichach, says the Rav Shulchan Aruch, asur liftoach petach keneged petach v'chalon keneged chalon. So halachically, you're not allowed to build a house where your door is directly opposite your neighbor's door, or your window is directly opposite your neighbor's window. Shelo yireh echad ma'asav shel chaveiro, so that you don't peer in, you don't have the opportunity even to peer in and see what your neighbor is doing. He says, and even if both neighbors say, I don't care, you want to build a window over there, I couldn't care less. I'm not an exhibitionist, and I'm a pretty private guy, or I'll put drapes on the windows, who cares? But still, some people say that it's aser. She'inzu midas tznius, sheyirzeh tashmisho shel zeh kol hayom. Because it's not considered to be modest that each person should have visibility to what his neighbor is doing for the entire day. In other words, even if you have two consenting parties, there is an opinion that says that the principles of modesty demand that you do protect yourself from the gaze of others, and that you also protect yourself, or you prevent yourself from seeing what other people are doing. The Amru Chachamim, and I think Paul had quoted this pasuk, It says our sages tell us, based on the pasuk in Parshas Balak, Vayisa Bilam es Einav, Vayar Yisrael es Yisrael Choshen lishmatav, that Bilam lifted up his eyes and he saw Israel encamped according to its tribes. And the sages comment and they say, Ra'a she'ein pitchei ohaleim mechuvanim zeh keneged zeh. He saw that the doorways of their tents were not aligned so that people could see from one tent into the other. In other words, everyone would position their tent in such a way that your doorway was always facing away from someone else's doorway. So Amar Ru'uyim halalu shetashre aleihim shechina. And based on that, Bilam said that they are worthy of having the divine presence rest upon them because of their immense modesty. Ba'afilu rishus harabim mafsekes beinehem. And even if there's, and so this halacha applies, argues the Rav Shulchan Aruch, even when you have a public thoroughfare that divides between the two houses. Asurim liftoach chalon keneged chalon im hachalonos gevohos. He says if the windows are elevated above the thoroughfare, you're still not, like, let's say on a second floor, you still cannot have windows of your neighbor, let's say on one side of the street, facing the window of another neighbor. And the reason is, she'en b'nei rishus harabim yecholim lir'os bahem derech hilucham. He says, just because there's people passing by, it's irrelevant since the windows are elevated above the public thoroughfare. The neighbors, the passers-by, don't see what's going on in those windows. And therefore, it's altogether possible that the person inside the home will be doing a private activity. He'll be walking past his window, and I, as his neighbor, will have visibility of his private activity that he's doing. The karkos bateim hengvos mekarka rishus harabim. And so therefore, their homes are elevated, or that floor is elevated above the public thoroughfare. And therefore, it's irrelevant that there are people, that there's foot traffic on the ground floor. That doesn't affect the private activity that's taking place on the second floor. Shehem yecholim liros bahem. Aval im b'nei rishus harabim yecholim liros bahem derech hilucham. But that it'll be different. Let's say the window that is facing my neighbor is on the ground floor, and there are passers-by, pedestrians that are constantly walking by that window. So then, ein lachosh afilu b'chalon keneged chalon. Then it's perfectly okay for me to construct a window opposite that window of my neighbor. And the reason is shaharei sof sof tzarach lios sanua b'tashmishav mipnei b'nei rishus harabim ha'ovrim sham kol hayom. He says, because in that situation, my neighbor who has his window open to pedestrian traffic will have to be careful not to do any private activity because of the pedestrian traffic. So my adding a window opposite his window is not in any way an invasion of his privacy, because his privacy has already been invaded by the pedestrian traffic. So therefore, it all depends. If the two windows, on the two sides of the street are at ground level, so that such that the pedestrian traffic can see into that guy's house, so then there's nothing wrong with me putting up a window on that also has visibility into his house, because since he's got to guard himself from the pedestrian view, he's not going to be doing anything private such that I would be invading his privacy. But if the two windows are elevated, let's say on the second story of each house, it's irrelevant that there's pedestrian traffic, and therefore I would still not be allowed to create a new window that is opposite his window on the second floor, because I would be invading his privacy. And therefore the same thing would be true if the two doorways are open up to a street. There's nothing wrong with neighbors having doorways that directly are opposite each other, because in that situation, it's totally okay for since I'm not going to be opening my door in my underwear to get the paper, because I may encounter pedestrian traffic, people taking a jog, right? I'm not, so I have to protect myself from doing anything immodest when I open my front door. So therefore, there's nothing wrong with my neighbor having a front door that is exactly opposite to mine, because there's no invasion of privacy in that situation. Okay, so with this halacha, now obviously there are many homes that are not in our own neighborhood that are not constructed in this way, but this is sometimes, and also you have to ask yourself the question: how do I mitigate a situation where the windows are already facing each other? Well, that's simple. You put up window coverings, you put up shades or blinds or things like that, and you should just be careful not to open the shades or the blinds, right? Or to make them somehow, you can buy material that will allow the sunlight in, but will occlude, your visibility. Okay, now yes. So if we take a look at the Imrei Yaakov over here, he says yesh osrim. There are those who forbid. What is he saying? That when both parties have no problem of invading each other's privacy, they say, I don't care. My life is an open book. I don't care what people see me doing. If you see me walking around in my underwear in my house, I don't care. It doesn't bother me. It's still not okay, because that's a flagrant violation of the standards of tznius, of modesty. And he says the isser deoraisahu, that it's a biblical prohibition to flaunt, your private activity. And therefore, based on that, it doesn't matter that you have a legal right to have a window opposite your neighbor's window. And so others disagree. Others say that it's not an isser deoraisa, it's only an isser if your friend is bothered by the invasion of privacy. But if he doesn't care, and he basically says, you want to build a window opposite my window, I don't care. You can go right ahead, it doesn't bother me. So then it's totally okay. Below adif me hezek ashanu shar hezek, because hezek re'iyah, peering into someone's private activities, invading their privacy visually, is no different from any other kind of damage. Let's say I have smoke coming out of my house that could potentially damage your property, and but you say, I don't mind, you can go right ahead. So then any kind of forgiveness on something that's going to damage the other person's property is totally permitted according to halacha. He says, okay, and so we'll finish this halacha Mirz Hashem tomorrow. I'm going to let you go.